What if the greatest story in women's basketball history is also its greatest lie? Think about everything you've seen over the past year: the packed arenas, the television ratings that shattered every record in WNBA history, the highlight reels, the sponsorship deals, the magazine covers, the breathless commentary from every major sports network declaring that Caitlyn Clark had single-handedly saved women's professional basketball. It looked perfect, almost too perfect. Because here's the thing about stories that look too perfect: they usually are. While the cameras were focused on the spectacle of Clark draining threes from half-court and filling seats in cities where the WNBA used to struggle to draw a crowd, something else entirely was happening behind the scenes. Something darker, messier, and far more revealing about the true nature of professional sports in the modern era. A respected coach with deep roots in Indiana basketball was allegedly pushed out of her position under circumstances that the league and its media partners have worked overtime to obscure. Veteran players reportedly felt marginalized and sidelined. A locker room that was supposed to be a team became a carefully managed marketing vehicle. And the biggest voice in sports media may have accidentally confirmed the entire
Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video.
thing in an unguarded moment that sent shockwaves through the executive levels of the league. This is the story the WNBA doesn't want you reading. This is the story of what really happened inside the Indiana Fever during the most scrutinized rookie season in the history of women's professional basketball. And once you understand what allegedly went on behind those closed doors, you will never look at the Caitlyn Clark phenomenon the same way again. Every major scandal in sports history begins the same way, not with a press conference or a leaked document, but with a whisper, a quiet conversation in a hallway, a comment made between people who assumed no one important was listening, a moment of unguarded honesty that cuts through the carefully constructed public narrative and reveals the machinery grinding away underneath. For months, people operating in the back channels of sports journalism had been hearing things, fragments of conversations, second and third-hand accounts from people close to the Indiana Fever organization who were deeply uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The murmurs suggested a franchise in genuine crisis, a team torn between two fundamentally incompatible visions for its future, and a coaching situation that was far more volatile than anyone in a position of power was willing to publicly acknowledge. But whispers are just whispers without a credible source to give them weight. And for a story this significant, involving a player of this commercial magnitude, nobody with genuine knowledge was willing to put their name on it. The access journalism culture that dominates modern sports media is brutally effective at keeping inconvenient truths buried. Reporters who ask the wrong questions find their credentials revoked. Executives who speak out of turn find their careers quietly derailed. The system protects itself with remarkable efficiency. That is, until someone with enough stature and influence says something they perhaps shouldn't have said. According to multiple sources with connections to the inner workings of sports media, Stephen A. Smith, the undisputed heavyweight champion of sports commentary and one of the most influential voices in the entire industry, allegedly made a comment during what was described as either a pre-production meeting or a hot microphone situation that blew the lid off the entire story. The comment, according to those who heard it or learned of it through reliable channels, suggested that Stephanie White's departure from the Indiana Fever was not the clean, mutually agreed upon career transition that the official narrative presented to the public. It was, allegedly, a forced resignation. And the force behind it came from the very top. To fully grasp the gravity of what allegedly happened inside the Indiana Fever organization, you first need to understand exactly who Stephanie White is and what she represents to Indiana basketball specifically, and women's basketball more broadly. Stephanie White is not some interchangeable coaching figure who wandered into a high-profile job. She is Indiana basketball royalty in the most literal sense of that phrase. She was Indiana's Miss Basketball. She was a Purdue superstar whose playing career defined an era. She was part of a national championship. She returned to coaching in Indiana and guided the Fever to the WNBA Finals in 2015, cementing her status as one of the most accomplished and respected figures in the entire sport. Her coaching philosophy was built on principles that have produced championships at every level of basketball for decades: defense, toughness, team chemistry, a system where every player on the roster understands their role, feels valued, and is developed with long-term success in mind. She believed, as every championship coach ultimately believes, that no single player is bigger than the collective, that the team is always the unit that wins, not the individual talent operating within it. When Stephanie White returned to lead the Indiana Fever into what everyone understood would be an enormously significant new chapter in the franchise's history, it was widely celebrated as exactly the right choice. She knew the organization. She knew Indiana basketball. She had credibility with players, with fans, and within the broader coaching community. She was the architect the franchise needed to build something sustainable and meaningful around its extraordinary new addition. Then Caitlyn Clark arrived, and everything changed overnight. Let's be absolutely clear about one thing before we go any further. Caitlyn Clark is a generational basketball talent. Her impact on the WNBA's visibility, commercial appeal, and cultural relevance has been nothing short of transformational. The numbers are not manufactured. The arenas are genuinely full. The television ratings are legitimately historic. Whatever else is true about the situation surrounding her arrival in Indiana, her talent and her drawing power are completely real. But here is what the celebratory narrative consistently glosses over. The Caitlyn Clark effect didn't just bring attention and revenue to the Indiana Fever. It also brought an almost incomprehensible level of pressure, expectation, and commercial obligation that fundamentally altered the nature of what the Indiana Fever was supposed to be as a basketball organization. The moment Clark was drafted, the Fever stopped being primarily a basketball team trying to build toward a championship. They became, whether anyone wanted to admit it openly or not, a marketing vehicle for the most commercially valuable asset the WNBA had ever produced. Every game became a national television event. Every possession was analyzed and dissected. Every win and loss carried implications that extended far beyond the standings. For a coach like Stephanie White, whose entire professional identity was built around the integrity of team basketball and the patient, methodical work of building something real, this created an immediate and fundamental tension. Because the people making decisions above her allegedly had very different priorities. According to the accounts that have emerged from within the organization and its surrounding circles, White found herself in an increasingly untenable position, where her basketball judgment was being overridden by commercial considerations. She wanted to build a balanced offense that would protect Clark from the physical and mental toll of being the entire team's offensive engine, while also developing the other players on the roster into genuine contributors. She argued, with the full weight of her coaching experience behind her, that a system built entirely around one player was not a path to a championship and would ultimately serve nobody's interests, including Clark's. The response she allegedly received from above was essentially a rejection of her entire coaching philosophy. The directive, as sources have described it, was clear and non-negotiable. The offense runs through Clark. The marketing runs through Clark. The identity of this franchise runs through Clark. Fall in line with that reality or face the consequences. Every conflict of this nature has a moment where the tension becomes so extreme that it can no longer be managed or contained. For the Indiana Fever situation, that moment allegedly arrived through one of the most discussed storylines of Clark's entire rookie season: the question of how the organization and the league were going to respond to the physical treatment Clark was receiving on the court. The narrative that dominated sports media coverage presented this as a simple and uncomplicated story. Clark was a rookie being tested by veterans who wanted to send a message. The league needed to step up and protect her. End of discussion. But the reality inside the organization was apparently far more complicated and contentious than that clean storyline suggested. One version of events suggests that White was absolutely furious about the league's passive response to the physicality Clark was being subjected to, and demanded that the organization take a loud, public stance, demanding better officiating and more meaningful consequences for players who crossed the line. When the front office allegedly chose a more measured, image-conscious approach that prioritized not making the league look chaotic over actually advocating forcefully for their players' safety, White viewed it as a profound betrayal of the organization's responsibility to its athletes. A separate and perhaps even more revealing version of events suggests the conflict ran in an entirely different direction. This account posits that White, drawing on her background in old-school Indiana basketball, where toughness and collective accountability were non-negotiable values, wanted the team to respond on the court in the way that basketball has always handled these situations. Not through illegal or dirty play, but through the kind of fierce, physical, we protect our own basketball that sends an unmistakable message to every opponent in the league. You come for our player, you're coming for all of us. This approach was allegedly shut down immediately and emphatically by an organization that was terrified of any association with on-court aggression. The commercial image of Caitlyn Clark, the brand, required a certain kind of clean and family-friendly environment. The notion of the Indiana Fever adopting a harder, more physically intimidating identity was seen as a threat to that image, regardless of whether it made sound basketball sense. Either way, the outcome was the same. Stephanie White found herself in a position where she was no longer actually being allowed to coach. Her professional judgment was being overridden at every turn by people whose primary concern was not winning basketball games, but managing a commercial property worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She was the head coach in title only, a figurehead in a system that had already decided what it was going to be with or without her buy-in. Her departure under these circumstances wasn't simply a coaching change. It was, according to the story that has emerged through these various accounts, something much closer to an orchestrated removal. A system asserting its priorities and eliminating the obstacle standing in the way of total organizational alignment around the commercial agenda. If any of this is even partially true, the obvious and immediate question is why it hasn't been reported. Why aren't the major sports networks running investigative pieces? Why haven't the newspapers with dedicated sports sections assigned reporters to dig into this story? Why is the most significant behind-the-scenes drama in the history of women's professional basketball apparently invisible to the mainstream sports media apparatus? The answer requires understanding something fundamental about how sports journalism actually operates in the modern era, as opposed to how it presents itself. The relationship between major sports leagues and the media organizations that cover them is not the adversarial watchdog arrangement that journalism is theoretically supposed to represent. It is a deeply codependent commercial partnership where both sides have enormous financial stakes in maintaining a positive, drama-free narrative around the product. ESPN, to use the most obvious example, pays billions of dollars for the rights to broadcast sporting events. A media investigation that damages the commercial appeal of a product they've paid billions to air is not just journalistically inconvenient, it is financially self-destructive. The Caitlyn Clark story is the single most valuable narrative the WNBA has ever produced. The league and its broadcast partners have invested not just money, but their entire vision of the sport's future in the continued success and positive perception of Clark's career and the Indiana Fever's trajectory. A story suggesting that the organization is a toxic mess, that a legendary coach was forced out through corporate pressure, and that the league itself was complicit in prioritizing commercial interests over basketball integrity would be genuinely catastrophic for everyone with financial skin in the game. So the story doesn't get told, not because the reporters covering the WNBA are corrupt or incompetent, but because the system they operate within creates powerful incentives to look away from certain truths and powerful disincentives for pursuing them. Access journalism is a real phenomenon with real consequences. The reporters who ask uncomfortable questions lose access. The networks that air critical investigations lose relationships. The carefully maintained commercial ecosystem depends on everyone staying inside the lines. This is precisely why the alleged comment from Stephen A. Smith carries such explosive weight. He is one of perhaps a handful of figures in the entire sports media landscape who has accumulated enough personal stature, enough independence, and enough leverage that he can say something the system would prefer remain unsaid without immediately being erased from the conversation. His alleged confirmation of the real circumstances behind Stephanie White's departure didn't go through the normal channels of sports media publication, and was therefore much harder for the league and its partners to preemptively manage or suppress. The frantic damage control effort that reportedly followed his alleged comment tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the league took the potential fallout. You don't mobilize at the executive level to contain a non-story. The urgency of the response was itself a form of confirmation. Step back from the specific details of the Indiana Fever situation for a moment, and consider what this story, if accurate, represents about the broader direction of professional sports. We are living through a period of unprecedented commercial expansion in women's basketball. The growth is real, the interest is genuine, and the cultural shift toward taking women's sports seriously as a mainstream entertainment product represents something genuinely positive for the athletes who have dedicated their careers to a league that operated for years on the margins of public consciousness. But commercial expansion at this scale always comes with a cost, and the cost is almost always paid by the people who prioritize the integrity of the sport over the demands of the commercial machine surrounding it. Coaches who believe that team basketball and player development matter more than any individual star's highlight reel. Veterans who spent years building their games in a system that valued collective contribution and suddenly find themselves reduced to supporting cast members in someone else's story. The entire culture of a sport that gets quietly flattened by the bulldozer of billion-dollar interests. Stephanie White, if the accounts of her situation are accurate, represents something important and something worth defending. She represents the idea that the sport itself, the actual basketball, the chemistry and the grit and the collective effort, has to mean something. That you can't build a genuinely sustainable championship culture on a foundation of commercial calculation and marketing-driven decision-making. That treating a coaching legend with decades of earned wisdom as an obstacle to be removed, rather than a resource to be valued, is not just professionally wrong but strategically stupid. The WNBA's extraordinary recent growth is real and worth celebrating, but growth built on a manufactured narrative, one where the difficult truths are buried and anyone who doesn't fit the scripted story is quietly written out of it, is growth built on an unstable foundation. The question isn't whether the Indiana Fever will win games or whether Caitlyn Clark will continue to be the most exciting player in women's basketball. She almost certainly will. The question is whether the league and the organizations within it are capable of being honest about what it actually takes to build something real and lasting, or whether they've decided that the illusion of perfection is more valuable than the messy, complicated truth of genuine growth. Here is where we land after following this story to its logical end. We have a franchise that allegedly sacrificed its head coach's authority on the altar of commercial convenience. We have a league that allegedly coordinated with its media partners to ensure the unflattering details of a significant organizational crisis never reach the public. We have a sports media apparatus that, by its own financial logic, has powerful reasons to look the other way and keep selling the fairy tale. And we have one of the most powerful voices in sports who allegedly let something slip that the entire system was designed to prevent from being spoken aloud. None of this diminishes Caitlyn Clark's talent. None of it erases the genuine excitement and growth the WNBA has experienced. But all of it matters enormously for anyone who cares about women's basketball as something more than a commercial product. Because the sport deserves better than to have its most significant storylines managed and sanitized by people whose primary concern is protecting a financial investment. Stephanie White deserved better. The veteran players on the Indiana Fever roster who reportedly found their development subordinated to the demands of a marketing machine deserved better. And frankly, Caitlyn Clark herself deserves better, because if the foundation beneath her is as compromised as these accounts suggest, the long-term consequences for her career and her relationship with teammates and the broader league will eventually make themselves felt in ways that no amount of narrative management can prevent. The silence from the league is telling. The carefully curated media coverage is telling. The urgency of the alleged damage control effort is telling. When an institution works this hard to make sure you only see one version of a story, the version they don't want you to see is almost always the one that matters. The WNBA is at a crossroads. It can choose the path of genuine integrity, honest storytelling, and a commitment to building something real even when that process is uncomfortable and messy and doesn't fit neatly into a highlight package. Or it can keep selling the perfectly polished fairy tale and hope that nobody pulls the thread hard enough to unravel the whole thing. But fairy tales, no matter how elaborately constructed, always end the same way when they're built on a foundation of convenient fictions rather than uncomfortable truths. And the truth, as someone once allegedly said in an unguarded moment that sent shockwaves through an entire industry, has a way of getting out. The question now is whether anyone with a platform big enough to matter is willing to make sure it stays out.